Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on the first part of the novel Line of the Sun. Beginning first with some background information on the author, Judith Ortiz Coffer, who was born in Puerto Rico in 1952. She migrated back and forth between the island and Paterson, New Jersey while she was growing up. She moved as a teenager in 1967 to Augusta, Georgia, and graduated in 1974 from Augusta College, where she was the only Puerto Rican student. She received her master's in English literature at Florida Atlantic University and taught at the University of Georgia until her retirement in 2013. She died in 2016 from a rare form of liver cancer. Here, just picked a selection of some of her works. She was a very prolific writer. She wrote poetry, she wrote short stories, novels, essays. These are just some of my personal favorites. The first is called Silent Dancing, a partial remembrance of a Puerto Rican childhood. The next is called La Endeli, which was a collection of stories and poems. And the last is called The Meaning of Consuelo, which was another novel. But I encourage you to, especially if you enjoy this novel, to look her up and pick up some of her previous work as well. So the characters and the setting of Line of the Sun, it is set in the 1950s in the town of Salud, Puerto Rico. And the second part will be set in the 1960s in Paterson, New Jersey. So we will get a sense of this back and forth movement that she herself grew up with. The characters span two generations, the migrating generation of the 1950s that leave the island, and the generation born and raised in the United States mainland. In this first part, we get a sense of how many of these characters experience belonging and navigate belonging in very different ways. We see what belonging means for the men, like Guzman and Rafael. We certainly see quite a number of different women and female characters, like the Holy Rosary Society, La Cabra, Mama Cielo, and Ramona. And then we also see belonging and sexuality referenced with Carmelo and his relationship with Padre Cesar. Now, one of the things we see, especially through Guzman and Carmelo, are discussions of masculinity, sexuality, and belonging, and how they all navigate what masculinity means in this particular context. So we first see what it is that Guzman learns from his visits in the cane field, distributing lunches to the men. In this first quote, in a few months, these men had taught him much about hard work and laughter, how to swing a machete so that the cane fell gracefully as a dancer away from you, and how to roll a perfect cigarette. They had also spoken about women. Their talk had been in vague terms so that the real location of their pleasure was never mentioned, but Guzman felt the knowledge creeping over his skin. We also see Carmelo and Padre Cesar transgressing against acceptable forms of masculinity. In this quote, it didn't seem natural to her for young men to spend so much time together reading love poems to each other. And this is an example of how, one of many examples we see in the novel of how Carmelo's sexuality is policed by the town. We also see it in this other quote. They say Carmelo could not walk down the street without some shiftless person calling out to him, that his trousers were too tight in the crotch, or that his cologne could be smelled for miles, and that if he didn't take care, dogs would confuse him for a bitch in heat. So this is the kind of hostility he starts experiencing once it becomes public that he'd had a somewhat questionable relationship with the priest of the church. And so we ultimately see how this kind of policing that he experiences and constant surveillance and hostility creates a situation where he doesn't feel he can belong in this town and ends up lying about his age and enlisting in the military and dies during the Korean War. We also see a number of transgressive female characters. La Cabra is definitely one of these, and how she herself is ostracized by some of the other female characters like the Holy Rosary Society and the town itself because of her sexuality. She's alleged to be a prostitute. She practices questionable spiritualism. She transgresses from the acceptable Catholic faith. She comes from New York, so she's even though she is Puerto Rican, because she's had this migrant experience outside of the island and returns, she's perceived as having acquired some kind of transgressive characteristics from that experience. She represents Americanization and modernization. She owns a television and is the only other person to do so. And the only other person to do so in the town is the American farm owner. And she also entertains men in her home, even though she's a single woman. All of these characteristics and behaviors are things that are not acceptable in 1950s society in a small town in Puerto Rico. Another transgressive character we see that is also quite interesting is Doña Amparo. She runs the Domino Hall, which is a space for men, yet she's not targeted by the Holy Rosary Society because she also took care of the wives of the wayward men. And this is an interesting quote about how she navigates these kind of gender binaries and issues around sexuality. She had chosen power over respectability and had never regretted the choice. She also knew that in order to compete in a man's world of property ownership, she had to make others dependent on her in as many ways as possible. She did this by providing the men of Salud with a place where they could play their games, see their women, drink, and even sometimes, yes, spill a little blood. This too was a need with some men. As she grew in size and in the knowledge of men's minds, Doña Amparo had discovered that her presence, her great bulk, made the men feel protected and secure, even as they pursued their dangerous vices. She was a mother watching her sometimes wayward sons at play. So even though she is, in essence, running a place that is a masculine place, a place where men come to basically express their deviant behaviors that are certainly not accepted by groups like the Holy Rosary Society, there's something different about her, and that is that she is a heavyset woman, right? She's not considered sexually attractive because of that, and is instead perceived as this over motherly kind of hen, watching over all of her wayward sons, as she says. So this is an interesting sort of juxtaposition between her and the character of La Cabra. Gendered belonging for women is definitely represented or defined by Catholicism, right? And in the novel, upheld by groups like the Holy Rosary Society, which dictates what is appropriate behavior for women in the town. They have a sense of power through their position within the Catholic Church. You see Doña Tina seeing herself as the Queen of Salud Society, a situation that by its nature demanded that she and her ladies be the watchful guardians of the moral status of the town. And she sees herself as determined to run La Cabra out of town, right? The kind of deviance that she represents is so unacceptable and so perceived as not belonging to the moral status of this town that she isn't accepted to even be in the margins of the town. She has to be kicked out. Mamacilla and Ramona represent the holiest role for women as suffering mothers. Now, this sense of belonging eventually leads to migration. In Guzman, we see this quote, "There were still others whose memory he would take with him, so that in the cold rooms he would occupy for many years, the remembrance of these lives would eventually guide him back to his birthplace like a beacon in a foggy night. This he knew. He loved this place that did not love him, and he knew he would leave it and come back." And so we see over and over again, Guzman, even though he is a man, he's heterosexual, he fits within some of the definitions of masculinity. He finds himself over and over again, because of his relationships with women like La Cabra, to fall into that space of unbelonging, where he's not acceptable in the community, where he is perceived as a threat to the nice virginal women in the town, and ultimately feels that he can't stay there, he has to leave. And Rafael, we see he is freed from the financial responsibility over his family when his father commits suicide, and he decides to marry Ramona and joins the Navy. So in Rafael, we see this young man whose family descends from the Spanish ancestry, from the elite families, but because of his father's alcoholism, the family is relegated to poverty, and they're kind of become like the black sheep of their family. And so we see this relationship between Rafael and his father, and how he feels this responsibility over his mom and the rest of his siblings. But once that responsibility is no longer there, when his father passes away and there is some money that comes to the family, then he can finally feel like he can move on and make his own life, right? And at this point, by this point, he has met Ramona, he's fallen in love with her, and he decides that joining the Navy is the right path for him, that will lead him away from, right, this small town and its limitations. Well, Ramona sees marriage to Rafael as a way to escape from Mama Cielo's limited household and her role as a mother figure to her younger siblings that she's been kind of relegated to by her mother, right? So we see that there are all these characters that in one way or another feel that they can't belong in the town of Salud, and for whom migration, leaving the island to the United States, becomes the option at that point. Now, part of what I wanted to do also is give you a little bit of background of historically what is going on in Puerto Rico at this point. So what we see here is, with the representation of Guzman out in the cane fields, is really represented what it was left by that point of the early 1950s of sugarcane workers, right? Sugar had become, under the United States influence, one of the major sources of employment for workers. But in the 1950s, what occurs is a shift towards modernization and industrialization of the island through what becomes known as Operation Bootstrap, which was essentially an industrialization plan that provided tax incentives to American corporations to move their businesses to Puerto Rico, build plants, factories, and so on, and use the cheaper, more passive labor force that they could find in Puerto Rico. And so this was all sold to American corporations as a good alternative to American labor. And so for a short time, this did work. There was an increase in types of jobs that were made available, but it wasn't enough to make up for the large number of unemployed that still existed on the island. And so migration became part of the policy as well, where on the one hand, you were creating all of these industries on the island to create jobs there, but that was not going to be enough. And so simultaneously, there was a plan to encourage migration from the island, encourage people to move to the United States to find employment here. And one of the ways that was done was through contract labor, where contracts were created between employers in the United States and folks in Puerto Rico, where people would be recruited to come to one of these jobs. And we see this is what Guzman is experiencing towards the end of that first part. So workers are recruited to come to the US during this time period. The types of work that they're recruited to come and do include food processing plants through the War Manpower Commission. Women were recruited as domestic workers in places like New York and Chicago, and thousands of them were actually brought to the United States to work on farms. I know typically we have this sort of image that Mexican Americans are the ones who are farm workers, and sort of any kind of image out there about Puerto Ricans is more of a as urban dwellers and working in factories and so on in urban spaces. But in reality, Puerto Ricans were brought throughout different parts of the United States for decades and still into today to work in different kinds of farms. And so this is what we're seeing Guzman experiencing. Now, there are limitations to this contract work. The point of having contracts was to stipulate at the very beginning what the conditions of work were, what the pay was, what kind of housing would be provided, and so on. But employers didn't always fulfill these contracts, paying less than they promised in these contracts, not providing adequate housing. Many of these workers experienced a lot of discrimination and abuse. And workers were often told that if they abandoned their contracts, they would lose free passage back to Puerto Rico and would be subject to the draft. So this is part of the experiences that contract laborers had during this time period. And so we'll see that this is how Guzman in particular ends up arriving to a farm in New York. And in the second part, we'll see how that continues to develop. So this here ends the lecture for this week. I look forward to seeing your thoughts on how belonging and citizenship appears in this novel and how it impacts all the various characters. Have a great week.